Yes.
Bryce is player with the Carolina Panthers. How are you doing?
I'm blessed. How are you?
Good, good. Sure, excited. I'm going to hand you over to our owner, David Kemper.
For sure. I appreciate
All
it.
right.
Hey, Bryce.
How we doing?
How you doing? You remember in Arizona's Super Bowl when I told you we were going to pick a quarterback this year? We're not going to wait till next year?
Yes, I do remember that.
Remember that conversation? I wasn't kidding. I wasn't kidding. So you want to trade us some Sweet Home Alabama for some Sweet Carolina?
I can't wait.
All right, well, we're so excited to get you. I mean, we really are excited to get you,
Bryce Young was the #1 overall pick in this year's NFL draft. If you didn't know this, then you live under a rock, unless you don't follow football religiously, which is okay if you aren't American. Just kidding. Hello everyone, and welcome to another Madden simulation video. Today we are focusing on a career sim, and you all voted for me to do Bryce Young first. Week 1 is already in the books for the NFL season, which means the most updated rosters update has come to Madden and will continue to do so every Thursday. And this is mainly why I wait to do simulations instead of using the preseason rosters, which is way too early like all the other people in my opinion, but no hate and no bad juju towards the people that do that. Now, the Carolina Panthers traded up in the draft since the #1 pick belonged to the Chicago Bears, and they trust Justin Fields enough for another season, so Carolina moved up to grab Bryce Young, the 5'10", 208-pound quarterback from Alabama. Now, ESPN's experts stated pre-draft that Young is a fast processor with a quick release and the touch to lead receivers to yards after the catch. He has rare poise, no moment is too big for him, and he rarely makes mental errors. He's a pocket passer first, but Young has the mobility to extend plays and effectively run or scramble. He has held up well except for a shoulder injury that limited him for a few weeks in the middle of the 2022 season. And even though he has a short linear frame by NFL quarterback standards, they went on to compare him to Drew Brees and eventually said he would not only be an ideal fit for the team's new head coach, Frank Reich's offense, but he would be a Rookie of the Year candidate. Now, last season, Carolina used 2 top-picked QBs from the 2018 draft, Sam Darnold, who the Jets took #3, and Baker Mayfield, who the Cleveland Browns selected #1 overall. But this isn't the first overall pick the Panthers have used on a quarterback in most recent history. They took Cam Newton back in 2011 at the #1 spot, which worked out pretty well for a while. He led them to a Super Bowl, he broke some records, and they ended up losing that Super Bowl to Peyton Manning and the Broncos. He also grabbed an MVP as he was doing all of this as well. Now, I have realistic sliders for player skill, progression, and regression, as well as realistic age sliders for both as well, since we don't want the entire league getting to 99 overall like some of these other people that are running sims. Again, no hate towards them. So player development, along with how they perform with their systems and teammates, will be a factor. So without further ado, let's get straight into this.
Perfect.
Backup Andy Dalton, so he's got a decent mentor as well when it comes to running backs. He's got Miles Sanders, who can do a lot of good work for him. And then the main thing, the receiving core, you got a older Adam Thielen coming in, DJ Chark Jr., who I think could put up some pretty big numbers, Laviska Shenault Jr., who should be a good slot, Jonathan Mingo, who could develop into something. He's got the tags as a future starter. And then Terrace Marshall Jr., a future starter tagged player as well. And I actually think this guy in real life is going to be a stud. And then you've got Smith Marset. This is where things get a little wonky. First off, they have 5 tight ends on this roster, so they have to be wanting to run the ball. They want a lot of pass protection, run a lot of triple tight end formation, some big jumbo packages so that they can run the ball with Miles Sanders. Taking a look at Bryce Young, of course, he was the #1 overall pick, so he's going to be a little bit higher in the overall compared to other rookies, and he's going to have a hidden dev talent, 5'10", 204 pounds. At the end of his first season, the Panthers ended up going 10-7 overall, and with the surprise to me, the entire division made the postseason. However, in the playoffs, the Panthers were the 6th seed and ended up facing the Green Bay Packers, who were the 3 seed at the time, and they ended up losing 33-14 in the very first round. When it came to the NFL MVP race, as a rookie, it would be pretty tough for him to be in there, but he's not at all. So that wasn't to be expected, and it's also not disappointing. He was nowhere to be seen in the Offensive Player of the Year for the NFC. However, Miles Sanders did make it into that 10th slot for the voting. When it came to Offensive Rookie of the Year for the NFC, Bryce Young finished 4th, so not too shabby. And then, of course, for the best QB in the NFC, he was nowhere to be seen once again. Taking a look at his regular season stats, he had a passer rating of 92.3. He threw for 3,452 yards, 22 touchdowns, and 14 interceptions. And he had a 68% completion percentage, and he averaged about 203.1 yards per game. When it came to rushing, he had 75 carries for 272 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1,000-yard rusher in Miles Sanders, who ended up finishing with 1,189, and he had 8 touchdowns. As for receiving, Adam Thielen had the most, but was still under 1,000 with 926, and he had 8 touchdowns to go with it. DJ Chark Jr. had half the amount of touchdowns and was 689 yards total. All right, heading into season number 2 now. Bryce is a 79 overall, and they have upgraded him to become more of a scheme fit. So instead of an improviser, he's more of a field general, but he still has those improviser tendencies. And he's a superstar now, so he has the gutsy scrambler. At the end of his next season, they finished 8-9 and were the only team from their division to make the playoffs. He finished the season with a 99.3 rating, 3,775 yards, 33 touchdowns, and 17 interceptions. He completed 68% of his passes and averaged 222.1 yards per game. When it came to carries, he had 80 for 302 yards and 3 touchdowns. And Miles Sanders had another 1,000-yard rushing season with 8 touchdowns. And then Adam Thielen broke the 1K mark as well with 8 touchdowns. And Jonathan Mingo was close with 911 yards and 9 touchdowns. And out of the slot, Shaheed finished up with 7 touchdowns as well. They lost to the Eagles 28-25 in the wild card. Bryce Young did make the Pro Bowl. He was nowhere to be found in the MVP race, nowhere to be found for Offensive Player of the Year, but he did finish 5th for best quarterback in the NFC. Going into his 3rd season, he's now an 82 overall, still a superstar, and has been given another ability, which is sideline deadeye. However, the Panthers felt it necessary to draft Charles Haskins, a quarterback in the 6th round, and has a hidden dev talent to back up our Bryce Young. Miles Sanders is back. Superstar Amari Cooper joins the team and is now wide receiver 1. And all the tight ends from last season bailed except for the 4th string Trevor Albertson, who was a rookie and is now our starter. Season 3, the Panthers finished 6-11 and missed the playoffs. Bryce Young finished with 110.8 passer rating, 3,187 yards, 23 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, completed 72% of his passes, and averaged 227.6 yards per game, 67 carries for 297 yards, and 6 touchdowns rushing. But he only played 14 games because he got injured, so Charles Haskins had to come in, and he had some decent numbers for only playing in 3 games. Miles Sanders once again went over the 1,100 mark in rushing and had 5 touchdowns, but the backup also had 7 touchdowns, and Bryce Young had 6 himself. As for receiving, they had a monster year. Jonathan Mingo had 1,062 yards and 8 touchdowns. Amari Cooper and Terrace Marshall Jr. both had 7 touchdowns apiece, with Cooper having 1,020 yards and Marshall almost putting up 1,000 himself. And due to his injury, he was nowhere to be found in the MVP voting, nowhere to be found in Offensive Player of the Year, and he finished 5th for Best QB. Going into season 4, he's now an 84 overall, still a superstar, still a starter, and has a little temporary morale boost. Old reliable 29-year-old Miles Sanders is back, but because of age, they brought in Brett Bradshaw from the draft to replace him soon. Speaking of old, 32-year-old Amari Cooper is still a superstar and still wide receiver 1. Jonathan Mingo is right behind him, and they brought in a new rookie to play the slot, Pat Halen. For tight end, Trevor Albertson apparently has been doing a great job, still under contract, but they did draft another tight end with the future starter tag. At the end of the season, the Panthers finished 12-5 overall, making them the 4th best team in the NFL, the 2nd best team in the NFC, and winning their division, making the playoffs. Bryce had his best season yet. 101.8 rating, 3,949 yards, 29 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, and 232.3 yards per game on a 69% completion percentage. He also carried the ball 83 times for 295 yards and 2 touchdowns. He got 4 Player of the Week nominations, the most in any of his seasons thus far. Miles Sanders was limited on touches, so he didn't make 1K. The rookie ended up getting 522 yards and 7 touchdowns touchdowns himself. Amari Cooper had a monster year once again with over 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns. And halfway through the season, they ended up trading for Tyler Higbee at the tight end position as well. In the playoffs, they beat the Packers 42-14 in the wild card, which then they went on to beat the Cowboys 28-21, and finally defeating the Falcons 31-28 in the NFC title game, giving themselves their first Super Bowl berth. However, they ended up losing that Super Bowl to the Colts 28-21. Once again, nowhere in the voting for MVP, nowhere for Offensive Player of the Year, but Amari Cooper did finish 6th, and for Best QB in the NFC, he finished 8th this year. It's now his 5th season, he's on a contract year, and he now has his 3rd superstar ability, which is Jukebox. The Panthers finished the season 9-8, making the playoffs. He finished with 3,977 yards, 27 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, 233.9 yards per game, and a 71% completions. He had 77 carries for 299 yards and 2 touchdowns. Amari Cooper didn't reach 1,000, but he was close, as well as Pat Halen, and Cooper had 10 touchdowns. In the playoffs, they lost their first round matchup against the Seahawks 20-17. And in week 3, he re-signed with the Panthers for a 5-year, $213 million contract, making him the highest paid player on the team. For MVP and Offensive Player of the Year, he's nowhere to be found in the voting again, but he did finish 8th for Best QB in the NFC. They finished 9-8 in his 6th season, making the playoffs, but he got injured towards the end of the season and had to miss both playoff games. They beat the Cowboys 21-16 and then eventually lost 28-14 to the Falcons. However, for his career, he had his career highs in passer rating and his touchdown to interception ratio with 30-3. When it came to his rushing stats, they were nothing special. And he finished 2nd for Best QB. In his 7th season, he completed 68% of his passes for 3,807 yards, 25 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. The team finished 10-7, making the playoffs, and Bryce finished 10th in MVP voting, 7th in Offensive Player of the Year, and 6th for Best QB. They ended up losing to the San Francisco 49ers 28-17 in the wild card round of the playoffs, but Bryce Young did get his 3rd Pro Bowl appearance, and the first time being QB1. In his 8th season, they did not make the playoffs. They finished 9-8, but Bryce Young did make the Pro Bowl. He got 3rd in MVP voting, 5th in Offensive Player of the Year, and 2nd in Best QB due to his 113.5 rating, 3,572 yards, 30 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and completing 73% of his passes. And also due to his 90 carries for 421 yards on the ground and 5 touchdowns. Going into his 9th season, Bryce Young is now the highest rated player on the Panthers, but for some reason they still felt the need to draft another rookie quarterback from Florida in the 2nd round who has the tag for future starter and is a 70 overall with a hidden dev talent and looks like George Clooney at 55 years old. The Panthers finished 11-6 in Bryce's 9th season in the league, and 3 out of the 4 teams in their division made the playoffs. They were one of them. They ended up beating the Packers 35-28 to then beat the Saints 27-17 and finally fell to the Atlanta Falcons in the NFC title game 38-28. However, Bryce Young had a really good year. He had 3,919 yards, 26 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, which is the closest he's gotten to having 4,000 yards in a single season so far. He completed 71% of his passes and averaged 230.5 yards per game, which is one of his highest so far. When it came to his ground game, he had 61 carries for 254 yards and 3 touchdowns. However, Bryce didn't make the Pro Bowl or get an MVP vote this year, finished 9th for Player of the Year on offense and 5th for Best QB. In Bryce's 10th season, the Panthers didn't do so well. They went 9-8 and missed the playoff, but Bryce had a career season and popped off. He had a career high in his passer rating, his yards, which he finally reached that 4,000 mark and beat it by 150, then had 26 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, had a career high 75% of his completions, and a career high 9.3 yards per attempt, and again a career high in 244.1 yards per game. He had 75 carries on the ground for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he also helped 2 of his best receivers both reach over 1,200 yards each and have 19 total touchdowns between the 2 of them. He did make the Pro Bowl, and of course it was a contract season, which is why he kind of balled out, which gave him a 2-year extension worth $105 million. Despite his overall interest in re-signing with the Carolina Panthers being extremely extremely low at this point. The year is 2033. It's Bryce Young's 11th season. He's 32 years old, and he's still the best player on the Panthers. So what does the team do in the offseason to help him win championships? They draft another George Clooney clone who's built like a marshmallow, a 66 overall, and a hidden dev talent in the second round of the draft. So how does Bryce Young respond to this? By having a mediocre season. A passer rating of 105.5, only throwing for 3,500 yards, 25 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and only averaging 208.4 yards per game. Rushing the ball was nothing special either. He had 68 attempts for 282 yards and 3 touchdowns. However, the team did go 12-5, win their division, and he led them to the Super Bowl for their second time. They were the number 1 seed and took down the Buccaneers 38-22, then beat the Cowboys, the 3 seed, 30-24, and had to go up against the Bengals in the Super Bowl, the other 1 seed. But of course, his team's kicker doesn't have ice in his veins. Instead, he's built like a hamburger, of course, looks like George Clooney, probably, and has gummy worms in his veins. But that's okay, because Bryce Young had a great playoff. I mean, he had 2 interceptions in the conference playoff game against the Cowboys, but hey, he had 321 yards against the Buccaneers in the divisional round with 4 touchdowns and no picks, and against the Bengals in the Super Bowl, he had 280 yards, 3 touchdowns, and he completed 90% of his passes. I mean, he only threw the ball 22 times, but still, 20 for 22, and he averaged 12.7 yards per attempt. However, with the mediocre season and the playoffs not counting towards any of the regular season awards, he wasn't even in the voting for MVP or Offensive Player of the Year, and he finished 8th in Best QB. It's 2034 and Bryce Young's in his 12th season, and of course it's a contract season, but it doesn't help that they went 6-11 and were awful again. But he did pop off once again. He had a passer rating of 102.9, threw for 4,263 yards, a new career high, by the way, 30 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, completed 68% of his passes, and averaged 250.8 yards per game, which is also a new career high. He's getting kind of old, so I wouldn't expect much for rushing, but he's staying pretty consistent with 72 attempts, 249 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And again, the Panthers didn't make the playoffs. Neither did he make a Pro Bowl. He didn't get any votes for MVP or Offensive Player of the Year, and he finished 6th for Best QB. Bryce Young is now 34 years old, and he elected to not re-sign with the Carolina Panthers. Instead, he took a 1-year deal with the San Francisco 49ers worth $28.5 million, with $13.7 million being guaranteed. Now, Bryce Young is considered the best player on this team. It helps that he's an 86 overall, but is boosted to 88, maybe because he's in a new environment, is on a new team, got a new deal, or maybe just a fresh start somewhere else. They do have him marked as a franchise QB, but also a trade target veteran, so they are open to taking offers for him, it seems. But he's still listed as a superstar, of course, and it looks like the most of the top players on this team are either super young and will be developed very nicely, and they've built around a good offensive line to keep them alive. And they also drafted a quarterback late in the draft who kind of resembles Brock Purdy. However, the team is god awful, and they went 3-14. That's the worst record Bryce Young's ever had. He also had his worst season in his career, due in partly because he missed 3 games due to injury. He only finished with 2,900 yards, 17 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. He did complete 72% of his passes, and he only averaged 208.2 yards per game. He also had a terrible game on the ground, his worst in his career in those as well. Only 1 touchdown with 42 carries and 139 yards. And when I said his team was awful, I wasn't lying. Donovan Gray, their future starter and second-year running back, only had 474 total yards for the entire season. When it came to receiving, they did have a 1,000-yard receiver in Mike Lewis, but that's basically like Mike Evans with Baker Mayfield throwing him the ball. He's still going to get 1,000 yards. And because of his injuries and his bad play, they didn't make the playoffs, he didn't make the Pro Bowl, and he got 0 votes in all 3 categories for MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, and Best QB. However, heading into the next season for 2036, Bryce's 14th season, the 49ers felt in declined to give him yet another contract, this time a little bit less, $21.8 million for 1 year and an $11.4 million guaranteed. For this season, however, Bryce is still a superstar, but no longer the best player on the team overall wise. Something that was much needed they were able to get done, which was go out and get a new running back in the draft. They got a new number 1 receiver for Bryce to throw to, and they also freshened up the bottom of their depth chart when it came to receivers. And when it came to tight ends, they still have the starter as a mentor player in his 11th season, and their backup is an X factor with wrecking ball going into his 9th season. Now this season, Bryce Young and the 49ers did a little bit better. They finished 9-8, but they still didn't make the playoffs. So this is the 3rd straight season where Bryce has not made it to the postseason. However, Bryce is on another 1-year deal, which means his contract's up at the end of the season, which of course means he had to have another big year, and he stayed healthy, which is a very important factor for him. He also threw 1,500 yards and 16 touchdowns to Jerome Donald, that guy they brought in to be their new wide receiver 1, which ultimately gave Bryce over 4,000 yards. He completed 70% of his passes again, and his numbers went back up across the board, including 31 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and 237 yards per game. He seemed like he could run again with 76 carries, 312 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And with a good bounce back year, even though they didn't make the playoffs, Bryce finished 5th in MVP voting, 7th in Offensive Player of the Year voting, and 4th in Best QB. In the offseason, Bryce once again re-signed with the 49ers on a 1-year deal worth $11.9 million. His bonus this time was only $7.97 million, but again, his overall interest and the success of the team is trending upward. However, you will never believe what they did after re-signing him. Just kidding, you probably would have guessed, and did guess correctly. They drafted a quarterback. Since they went 3-14, they had the number 18 pick as well, somehow, in the draft, and with that 18th overall pick, they took Alani Rivers out of Oregon State. Hidden depth trait, strong arm, and 71 overall quarterback, built like a marshmallow. You guessed it. Doesn't matter anyways. The team ended up sucking once again. They went 7-10 and finished last in their division. And Bryce Young did start every single game of the season. His numbers took a big dip too. He only averaged 200 yards per game. He only completed 69% of his passes, which wasn't too off from the year before, but he only threw 25 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and only threw for 3,400 yards. His rushing still stayed consistent pretty much. He had 80 carries for 306 yards and 2 touchdowns. However, that guy that caught 1,500 yards as a receiver the year before completely cut that in half and only had 811 yards and 6 touchdowns. Once again, no playoffs, no Pro Bowl, no MVP votes, no Offensive Player of the Year votes, and he finished 8th in Best QB in the NFC. Then Bryce Young was offered a 1-year contract again worth $11.9 million with the San Francisco 49ers. It was the same exact price and the same exact bonus. However, they decided to cut him loose. He then spent the entire offseason getting 0 offers as a normal player now with only a 76 overall and 37 years old going into his 16th season. Maybe it was because his stats were declining and he just wasn't getting any better or had a pretty mediocre career. Or maybe it was because he was expected $3.83 million a year as a 37-year-old mediocre QB at 5'10". But lo and behold, right when the preseason started, someone came calling, and it was the Kansas City Chiefs, who ended up signing him to a 1-year, $1.78 million contract. And when I say $1.78 million, I mean just $1.78 million. There was no bonus. Like, he was making the veteran minimum. He also wasn't going to be the starter. He was brought in as a backup and a mentor to help create a bridge for their number 1 pick in the draft, who was the 19th overall pick in the draft, the 6'2", 226-pound Taylor Berger, who's built like a burger and looks like he ate too many of them, but nonetheless, hidden depth trait and 74 overall. And of course, with a rookie quarterback leading your way and a rookie running back too, as by the way, the Chiefs ended up last in their division with a 6-11 record and not making the playoffs. This was the 2038 season, which means Bryce Young hadn't made the playoffs since 2033, which was 6 seasons ago. Again, they had the rookie quarterback named their starter at the very beginning of the preseason and all the way through the regular season, and Bryce Young ended up only playing in 3 games, throwing a total of 4 passes. He completed 3 of them, and he only had 29 yards. That rookie quarterback, by the way, Taylor Berger, well, the Berger man finished 3rd for Rookie of the Year. At this point in Bryce Young's career, he's a 71 overall, he's 38 years old, and he's going to be entering his 17th season in the NFL. His expected value has gone down as well. For only $2.25 million, you can have this man on your team, but he got 0 teams interested in signing him, 0 offers, and he wasn't even in the top 15 for QBs after the offseason ended and the preseason began. He ended up just sitting out the entire season waiting for someone to break their leg or have an Aaron Rodgers moment, but it never came. Finally, at the end of the 2039 season, he had been a free agent for the entire 17th year of his career, and he ended up retiring. And says he retired after 17 years, but he actually only played for 16. Taking a look at Bryce Young's career as a whole, he had a career passer rating of 106.9 in the regular season, which actually would be first in the record books, but Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, Deshaun Watson, Russell Wilson, Jimmy G, Joe Burrow, Drew Brees, Kirk Cousins, Dak Prescott, Tom Brady are all in the top 10. And of course, Tom Brady and Drew Brees are the only ones that are retired. So the rest have some time to catch up. Currently, Mahomes is number 1, and he has a 105.3 in the regular season for his career. When it comes to passing yards, he had 55,405. This puts him 11th on the all-time list, but it basically would be number 12 for him because Matthew Stafford is currently number 11 with 52,000. So by the time Bryce retires, I think in 2023, Matthew Stafford would be able to get 3,000 yards and surpass 55,000 and maybe even play another year. So I would say that Bryce probably got 12th. When it comes to touchdowns, he had 399 over his career in the regular season. That's good enough to place him right above Matt Ryan, who had 381, giving Bryce Young the 9th overall spot over all time. He had 110 interceptions, which puts him 102nd on the list. And believe me, the lower the better, because that means you threw less interceptions. The most interceptions is someone with like 380, I think. His yards per attempt was 8 yards, and that actually ties him with Steve Young for 7th. Yards per game, he averaged 220.7, which puts him 44th. He played 251 games, which ties him at the number 53 spot with Mike Ken, an offensive tackle. And he completed 71% of his passes, which is good enough to make him the number 1 all-time on that list, although Drew Brees is 3rd with 67.7, and the rest of the people in the top 10 are all still playing as well. When it comes to his rushing stats in the regular season, he had 1,080 attempts for his career, and that actually puts him number 2 on the list, right behind Cam Newton. The closest people to him are Russell Wilson with 901, so I'm guessing he would probably pass that as well. And Lamar Jackson, who's number 6 and has 727. So I think Bryce would probably end up number 4. As for yards, he had 4,218 rushing yards, which is good enough to put him at number 7. And for touchdowns, he had 43, which puts him at number 2 right now, tied with Steve Young. But Josh Allen is tied for 4th with 38. This is irrelevant to the Bryce Young placement on this board, but it was super interesting to me. The next active player on the actual list for most rushing touchdowns in a career is Aaron Rodgers. He's tied for 9th with 35. When it comes to the playoffs, he had a 114.55 passer rating, 3,046 yards, 27 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, 8.3 yards per attempt, 234.3 yards per game, and he played in 13 playoff games with a completion percentage of 72%. For rushing yards, or for rushing stats in the playoffs, he carried the ball 53 times for 217 yards, 4 touchdowns, 1 fumble, 4.1 yards per attempt, 16.7 yards per game, and again, he played in 13 playoff games. Overall, Bryce Young made $444 million in contract money. His legacy score in the Madden counter was 14,954. He was 125 wins and 136 losses in the regular season. His playoff record was 7-5, and that does not include his 2 Super Bowl losses. And his Super Bowl record was 0-2. So overall in the postseason, he was 7-7. Remember, he didn't play a couple games in the postseason because he was injured going into the playoffs at one point. He had 0 MVP awards, but the closest he got was 3rd. He had 0 Offensive Player of the Year awards. Closest he got was 5th. And he had 0 best QBs for any division. He did play in the AFC as a backup. When it all comes down to it, Bryce Young and his career in this simulation, he was the first overall draft pick in 2023 to the Carolina Panthers. He played for 3 teams, the Carolina Panthers, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Kansas City Chiefs. He was a 5-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time NFC champion in 2026 and 2033, and a 20-time Player of the Week. He had 8 playoff berths, all with the Carolina Panthers, and he was a 2-time division winner. He only made the playoffs with the Carolina Panthers. Most likely he would make the Hall of Fame because he's in the record books for a few things, especially as a dual threat quarterback, but he wouldn't be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And it looks like the game actually agrees, and they're not going to put him in the Hall of Fame on his first ballot. All right, well, thanks if you stayed all the way through. Thank you so much. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments below what you think about Bryce Young in this simulation, and if you think he's going to do something pretty similar to this in his career, or if you think he's going to be a great quarterback in the NFL. Also, let me know who you want me to do next. I know some other rookie quarterbacks have been highly asked for, like Anthony Richardson, CJ Stroud, and maybe even some 2-year players as well. And we can also move outside of just quarterbacks and move to others. All right, I don't want to make this outro any more longer than it already is because this was a pretty long video. My computer crashed while I was making this video. It took me like 6 hours to simulate the whole career, and then even more time to edit and record the extra stuff, and it's just a lot, but it's all for you, and I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.
Oh, hello there. It's Blue. I'm a terrible dancer, so ignore that version of me on the screen and listen to my voice when I say thank you for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and of course, click on another video of mine. I heard you'll like those over there. They're pretty good.